Appliques, they have endless possibilities. That's the title of our three-part series starting today on Sewing with Nancy. Welcome. I'm Nancy Zeman, and we're going to begin with the basics today. I'm going to show you how to work with scraps of fabric, practically any type of fabric, apply some paperback fusible web, and then apply it to your garment or project. And I'll give you the details of satin stitching around the edges with some creative touches, some basic touches, and then some other options for very detailed appliques of different fabrics. This is fun. I know you'll enjoy it.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's how-to sewing program with Nancy Zeman is brought to you by Pfaff, the largest European manufacturer of sewing machines. Look for Pfaff's line of creative sewing machines and hobby lock sergers. You'll do your best sewing on a Pfaff. By Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears for home, classroom, and industry. Ginger scissors and shears are the choice of professionals. And by Nancy's Notions Catalog, the catalog developed by Nancy Zeman, featuring specialty sewing, quilting, and serging books, notions, and supplies.
A scrap box is filled with possibilities for an applique. The fabric, as long as it's washable or even compatible with the base fabric, you can use. It doesn't just have to be cottons, which I am showing you from the top, or cotton blends, but we can work with knits. And a hint with knits is to back the wrong side of the fabric with a fusible web, a light or a fusible interfacing, and knit interfacing if best, to give it some stability. Lamaze, add a little glitz and shine. Even denim and corduroy add some depth and texture. So really your choices are limitless. I've even used wools after pre-washing the wool. It was kind of fun. I mentioned about using a paperback fusible web. They first came on the market about 10 years ago, so I know many of you have used them. But since that time, many different choices of weights have been available. There's paper applied to a fusible web. Here's an all-purpose webbing that I've peeled off the backing so that you can see kind of the weight of this web. There's now even a lighter weight. So working with chiffons and possibly lame fabric, as I just showed you, and then a heavyweight. You can almost see the thickness of this webbing that's applied to the paper. The first step is to trace the design or outline the design on the paper side of the fusible web. The design I'm going to work with first is very simple. Just repeated the design, kind of a little trumpet style, around the neckline of this top in different colors, different positionings of that applique. Since I cut out several of these, rather than tracing them, I found it just faster to cut out of a quilter's template or some cardboard a little shape. And then on the paper side, place the shape on the webbing and trace. Or you can simply place the webbing on top of a design and trace through the areas. This is a perfect project for kids to help you with on simple projects, and also to do the pressing, and possibly you can do the stitching. So you have the shapes traced on the web. After doing this, then work with your fashion fabric, and if you have interfacing applied like I am working with a knit, simply place it paper side up on the wrong side of the fabric and press. The directions say anywhere between 3 and 5 seconds. It doesn't take long at all to get that positioned into place. Then simply trace the outline or cut around the outline, and this piece has been cut, and then peel off the paper backing. The web now is off of the paper and onto the wrong side of the fabric, and you can position this onto your garment wherever you'd like. Just position it on the fabric and cover with a press cloth and fuse into place. We'll be doing this many times throughout this series, but this is the important part, how to get the web applied to the wrong side. Now you may be working with more complicated designs than this first one that I showed you, perhaps something that has a direction, letters, or a mirror image. And these three initials I'd like to applique on a tote bag, but if I would trace the initials in this position onto the fusible web, I'd have a mirror image. They'd be backwards. So use the light table method, or place your design up on a window, trace from the wrong side, or what I've done on this piece is just to outline the initials backwards from the wrong side of the piece of paper. Then place my fusible web over the paper and trace them so that they're on this area in the backwards position. Now just place this fusible webbing on the wrong side of the fabric, fuse, cut out, and your initials will be going in the correct direction. For some other ideas with working with applique, and that is kind of a no-sew approach. This is possible because of the heavy-weight fusible web. And on this placemat, which may be, as I mentioned earlier, a great project for kids to learn how to be creative, we've fused the stars using the heavyweight webbing. And as I take off this paper, possibly you can even see the glare of the web because it is rather heavy and is thick. That thickness has helped almost seal the edges of the fabric. This is not great for garment sewing, perfect for craft, home decorating ideas. And then simply place wherever you'd like your appliques to be on the project. With all fusing, cover with a press cloth and following the manufacturer's instructions, press and fuse for 5 to 10 seconds or whatever the instructions may state. That press cloth is an important detail. And this has been fused on. And it's just amazing how crisp this is, yet without any raveling of the edges. Not again for garment sewing, but for craft and home decorating. But we do have a garment idea for the no-sew approach with sheer overlays. On this top, I think it's really elegant look and soft look in the inset. This has a chiffon applique on the base fabric and covered with a sheer. There isn't any stitching because the sheer kind of holds everything together. We use the opposite type of fusible web. Rather than the heavyweight, use the lightweight as I showed you earlier. If you'd use the traditional webbing on sheer fabrics, it would go right through the fabric. But this way, it leaves it soft and pliable. Using the shapes, just simply apply or however shape the way you'd like. And chiffon is just kind of fun to work with because it has a lot of luster and elegance to it. Here it has been fused onto the base fabric, no stitching, because the sealing idea will come from the sheer that's placed on top. This is a perfect idea for collars, insets as we have here, for that special occasion dress that you want to add a special touch. Now for some other applique thoughts, and that is if you're going to have a very detailed applique. Mary Malari has been our guest on many Sewing with Nancy programs and has a lot of designs which we're going to use right now for something quite detailed. I photocopied this design and numbered the various pieces so that I would make certain that I would get them in the right direction. What I kind of like to do if I have multiple pieces that overlap and underlay and are next to each other, rather than making them the exact size, where one piece is going to overlap over the next, I add just a little seam allowance. Here on this trace sheet on the sections that we're going to have an underlay, you can see I added a slight seam allowance to piece number 4 and also down here on piece number 3. It just makes it easier to prevent that base fabric from showing through to the right side. There's no hard fast rule here, just add a little bit as you'd like. And then kind of build that applique on a pressing sheet, an applique pressing sheet, a non-stick surface. This works out well because you're not handling the base fabric over and over again. You're simply placing the pieces together and forming that applique before you place it onto the finished garment. Either use your, let me show you the original design, kind of have it as a base, and then apply all the pieces. Now there, as I mentioned, it's kind of like putting a puzzle together. Follow that base design, overlap the areas where you added some seam allowances. This one sneaks under here, and sometimes what I like to do is just build piece by piece. You don't have to put it all together like I'm doing right now. You could add piece 3 to 6 if you wanted to, or a little bit at a time. I'm just going to kind of piece this together, and we have it now kind of shaped and formed. Let me get it, there we go. And now to make this, we simply sandwich this between the applique pressing sheets. This is a non-stick surface, so the fusible webs will adhere to each other, but will not adhere to the plastic, to the pressing surface. And as I'm finished, this peels right off the back, even though the paper is removed. And it's somewhat, I could press it a little more carefully down there, but it's put together in a nice shape. This one I took a little bit more time with, and it's a little bit more perfectly put together, but now I can position this to the fashion fabric or to my project, and I don't have to worry about over-handling my applique piece. So these are the basics of working with an applique to get the fusible web on the wrong side, to apply it to the fabric and press. Now it's time to stitch around the edges, and I'll give you the details from basic to creative on stitching. The machine setup for doing applique stitches is quite simple. You're going to work with a basic zigzag stitch. Not too wide of a stitch, about a medium width. I have my machine set at a 3. My machine goes from 0 to 6, so that's a medium width. The stitch length should be short. 0.5 is where I have the setting. It's about 20 stitches per inch. The tension is important to loosen that top tension. I'm going to go for my number 5 setting to 3. To make certain that that bobbin thread stays underneath and the top thread forms a nice shaping on the top of the fabric. The foot, if you can change the foot to an open toe or an applique or embroidery foot, is nicely important because it has an open center of the foot, making it easier to see where you're going to be stitching. But most importantly, on the underside of the foot, there's a groove section allowing that satin stitch to follow in this path. It makes it easier to sew. The machine goes so much more smoothly. When I first started appliquing, really there weren't many choices of needles, just the basic type of sewing needles. Now there are machine embroidery needles that have larger eyes. The eye is important to be large because of the fine machine embroidery thread goes up and down in that eye so frequently that if it isn't larger, you're going to have frayed thread. These come in size 75 to 90, depending upon which size you'd like. The important idea is to have that larger eye to prevent breakage and fraying. We're going to talk about thread, and machine embroidery thread in cotton or rayon or possibly metallic is nicely important too. And especially for metallics, you may like to use a silicone treatment. The treatment simply means just put a couple of V's or W's on the thread, and as the thread unwinds, it is coated and it easily goes through your machine without breakage. Metallics tend to break more readily than other types of embroidery thread. For the bobbin, you want less is best principle. And I have just used a lightweight bobbin thread used for appliques or lingerie, wound a couple of bobbins. You don't really need this unless you're doing an extensive part of appliquing or satin stitching where you're going to have bulk on the underside. This will prevent that. Otherwise, just match your bobbin thread to your fashion fabric. So that's the basic setup at your sewing machine. Now to set up your fabric, you need one more element, and that is a stabilizer. On Sewing with Nancy, we use lots of stabilizers. They're temporary. They're put on the wrong side of the fabric and later torn away or removed by some other means. The basic, I should say, is a type that's non-woven. And you can tear it next to the stitches. You'll find this on ready-to-wear garments when you buy them. Many times they forget to tear this away. And when I first started sewing, I used typing paper or adding machine tape, but believe me, this is a little softer and a little easier to use. There are other types of stabilizers, types that press into place. They have a coating. Now this is temporary. This is not a fusible, permanent fusible, just like a wax type coating that can fuse or press to the wrong side of the fabric, and then again after stitching, tear this away. It helps lightweight fabrics to have just a little bit more body. You may have something at home that already works as a stabilizer, freezer paper in your kitchen. Or quilters, what I have is a quilter's type of freezer paper that has gridded lines already on it. But again, that wax coating works as a temporary fusible to apply to the wrong side. Another stabilizer type is the water-soluble type. Somewhat transparent, works great on delicate fabrics, bulky knits, silks. This is one that I always have in my sewing area, supplies area. And then the newest one, believe it or not, there's always a new one. This one has a look of muslin. It's woven. And it disappears with the heat of your iron. And I'll show you how this works a little bit later. I especially like this for delicate fabrics where tearing away the stabilizer could cause the fabric some damage or maybe distort the shape of your stitches. So you can see, you can choose a different stabilizer for your different projects. Now to do some stitching. On my sample, I have a variety of little squares and shapes with corners and angles so that you can get an idea of some of the techniques. Basically, with a zigzag stitch, you want to zig in the fabric, a zag off the edge. And you want the stitch close together and make it simple. Don't make it a lot of work. But here are some guidelines, especially for corners. I'm going to work with an outside corner first of all. And always test this on a sample to make certain that you have the correct setting. You may want to tweak it or adjust it just a little bit, and just stitch off the edge. Just encasing the raw edges. Again, a medium width is what I like, and by the way, I do have a stabilizer under my sample fabrics. And as I get to the corner, I'm just going to stop. If you can, stop with a needle in the fabric in the right position. I push my needle down button, or you may be able to control the control the needle with your foot pedal. Now I always like to, after turning the corner, give the fabric just a little jump start so that the next stitch goes into the preceding, or the stitches that have already been in the fabric, and so. You can't get any simpler than that. A zig in the fabric, a zag off the edge. That initial vest that I showed you in the introduction to this program was simply made with many, many outside corners such as this. Now for some inside corners, you're going to have to judge the width of the zigzag stitch, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. Let me just make sure I'm going to get the zig in the fabric and the zag off. Yes, here we go. And again, keep stitching. Now as I get to the corner, rather than stopping with the needle in the fabric at this corner, I'm going to stitch 3 to 4 stitches beyond the corner. Again, stopping with the needle in that right position. Hopefully I've judged the right amount, that I have stitched about the width of the zigzag. Then give it a little push and keep on satin stitching. And that will give you quite a nice edge. And as I raise this up, you'll be able to see both the inside and the outside corners. The outside corner, very easy to stitch. The inside corner, just stitch 1/4 of an inch or however wide the zigzag is beyond the corner, pivot and turn. Now for very sharp points on a triangle, or perhaps on a flower edge or petal edge, we're going to change the width of the zigzag as sewing. This may take just a little practice. The easiest way is to use a narrower stitch, but I kind of like to do this changing as I'm sewing. Again, I'll just sew this edge, and as I'm nearing the corner, what I'd like to do is to change the width of the zigzag, make it narrower. I'll stop again with the needle in. I have it almost to a 0 width. As I pivot, then I'll do the stitching in reverse. So a couple stitches at this narrow width, a couple more at a wider width, and just punch or turn the dial until you get back to your narrow, or your medium, I should say, stitch width. And that's all there's to this. So again, that may take just a little experimentation, and try it on a scrap. But as I hold this up, you can see how that angles to a point as opposed to having that wide zigzag area. Now for curves. Use your left hand to negotiate the fabric to position curves. On this outside curve, as I'm sewing this and I'm reaching the curve area, I'm going to kind of plant the fingers of my left hand on the fabric and hold the fabric taut, and lightly turn as I'm sewing. Now this is a relatively sharp curve, and as I'm going, I just kind of anchor this down so it has almost a pivot point to work with. If it's a very, very sharp curve, you may want to pivot, but I find just using the hands, it works so extremely well. These are the basics of working with the satin stitching, of turning corners, curves, and points. It's really simple. Give it a try. In this first program of Applique Endless Possibilities, I detailed working with the basics, working with a paper-backed fusible web like Wonder Under, Heat and Bond, or Stitch Witchery Plus, tracing the design to the paper side, fusing it to the fabric, cutting out the design, and finally pressing it to the fabric. Just as a quick review, working with a detailed design that has many components, after numbering the pieces, tracing the design on the paper side, remember to add a small seam allowance to the sections that will be underlapped or underlaid. Actually, when you tear off the paper and fuse it to the garment, you'll get the mirror image look of your design. This applique pressing sheet works well to build the design and fuse all layers together just by creating the sandwich. This prevents any of the web from getting on your iron prior to putting it on the project. This is a great way of not overhandling the fabric. I'll have some more applique ideas for you in our next program, Applique Endless Possibilities. Here's a message from Ginger, a national underwriter of my program. Ginger Incorporated manufactures the finest shears and scissors used by sewing enthusiasts across the country. Ginger products are valued for their tradition of excellence and quality. I rely on Ginger shears and scissors for all my cutting needs. Ginger is recognized by sewing experts as a premier line of cutting tools in home sewing and needle arts. Look for Ginger scissors and shears at your favorite sewing center or in the latest Nancy's Notions catalog. Welcome to Sewing with Nancy. I'm Nancy Zeman. This is our second program of my three-part series entitled Applique, Endless Possibilities. Today I'm going to go with creative stitching, using a satin stitch, but not just basic satin stitch, using varied stitch widths, combining thread colors, and even using some decorative threads combined with the basic stitches. It's kind of fun to work like this. There aren't any rules, just kind of guidelines of making creative appliques. And that's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy. This program builds on our first part of this series, where I'm going to show you kind of beyond the basics of working with some decorative stitches and stitch variations for appliquing. I have my machine set up for a satin stitch or a straight stitch. Actually, that's where we're going to start. With stabilizer underneath my applique fabric, and I'm going to show you a seed stitch. As I mentioned, a straight stitch, a short stitch length, set at about 1 or 18 to 20 stitches per inch. This little straight seed stitch is done as a design element in the middle of an applique, or perhaps some lines giving some direction. And it's about as simple as you can get, but the key to doing this is a short stitch length. It adds that little extra detail in the middle, giving it some dimension and maybe a little style too. Going back to the satin stitch, which is a little bit more common in appliquing, I'm going to set it for a short stitch length, about 0.5, and a medium stitch width. Now this is where I'm going to vary the stitches. I'm going to start with a satin stitch, and as I'm sewing, I'm simply going to change the width, make it narrower, or then if you'd like, increase it a little bit, either by your dial or your button, as I'm working with today. This takes a little practice to get exactly the look that you'd like, but it's kind of fun. Rather than just always working with that straight stitch, you can see how this kind of has some flowing motion. This next leaf has already one line of design stitched down it. I'm going to now blend some stitches, adding some extra stitch widths to this area. Let me just go back to about a 3 stitch width. And I'm working with another thread color. Blending 2 thread colors is interesting. Having half the stitch on the first area, and then the second half is going to go onto the fabric, so that the colors, like a painter would do it, blend together. Again, this is some area that you can kind of play with the stitch width a little bit, but I think it's kind of fun. And what we did in other Sewing with Nancy programs is work next with couching, but here let me first show you how those colors blend together. I'd like to show you on this next sample that we've zigzagged over thread, over cord, over ribbon, and that's another option just to give a wider look, maybe for a little extra detail. All of these stitches were put into the design that I showed you earlier, the vest that had this great looking applique. Ruth Seeley Shields is a designer of this applique and many other floral applique ideas, and she also recommends not only blending and varying the stitches with seed stitches, but also to add some decorative stitches, those built-in stitches from your sewing machine, as you can see at the top of this lily. Decorative stitches pose another alternative, or another option, I should say, for working with appliques, especially if you're working something quite simple, a geometric shape. On this little evening bag, we have, using synthetic suedes, some little square and rectangular shapes, and also you can see the very edges have decorative stitches. We've used metallic thread and just stitched around the edge. Now many of you may have built-in stitches or cams in your machine that you don't use that often. Well, that's kind of what I have. I don't use them all that often, but I have found that it's a way of working with these edges that's kind of interesting and nice. I have my machine set for a decorative stitch and a kind of a short stitch length. Let's go down here for the short stitch length. And practice on a various scraps before doing this to see if this is the look that you'd like. It's maybe a way to showcase some of those stitches that you wouldn't use on a regular basis. Again, my machine is set up for the traditional satin stitching. I have slightly loosened my top tension, working with decorative thread in my needle, using a machine embroidery needle, and just satin stitching over the edges. I should say decorative stitching over the edges. Now this is kind of an interesting stitch, but let me show you also some other options that you have in this area. But you can kind of see how this angles around and gives it a different flow. A feather stitch, a blind hem stitch are some other options for enhancing the edges, whether that's in the center of an applique or on the very outer edges. You can vary this without having to change the width of the satin stitch manually. Just do a little practicing. First, trying it on a sample, and you can work with these creative stitches with applique. It's kind of fun. Here's our next idea, a thread-only applique. Tone on tone, as you can see on this jade shirt, with a thread matching the shirt, following the applique design without actually fusing on extra pieces. This idea I think is kind of attractive because we're not working with a lot of contrasting fabrics, a totally different look than the other types of appliques we've had, but another possibility for you. First of all, you need to transfer the design to your fabric, and that can take on a couple of options. First of all is to cut a template, as I told you earlier in the first of this three-part series, the shape of your design, and with a washable marking pen or pencil, outline the shape of your design right onto the fabric. Now you may not care to go through this step of cutting a template, then forming in that or transforming it to the top of the fabric. Another option is to use transfer paper and the pencil kit that comes together. This is a non-woven type of fabric that resembles somewhat non-woven interfacing, but it's used as a transfer. Here you can see that I've placed this over the design and I'm tracing the outline of my shape. And with a purple pen, this purple marking pen comes with this paper. Then place the sheet on top of the fabric and retrace the design again. The ink from the pen goes through the transfer paper right to the fabric, giving you a faint design to trace. The purple pen comes out with cold water, and you can reuse the sheet over and over again. So using one of these two methods, get the design to the top of your fabric, and then back it with a stabilizer. We've talked with all kinds of different stabilizers, whether they're tear away, heat away, or type of water soluble. What I'm going to show you in this example is the muslin type of stabilizer that comes off with the heat of your iron. It's great for delicate fabrics, and why I like it for thread-only appliques is because you don't have a fused section to give that fabric additional strength. It's just thread on fabric, and this is a very delicate way of handling it. Now to do this thread-only applique, I've changed the stitch width quite a bit when stitching. I'm going to start off with this basic stitch width, but then narrow it, make it narrower or wider as I'm going along. And the wider width sometimes I like to do in the mainstream, in the middle of the design, and then as I'm getting to a point, I can get quite narrow. You can get very narrow actually because you're not having to cover an edge as you do with a traditional applique. Just have fun changing the stitch width on your sewing machine. And I'll go down again. This really is a personal preference how you handle this, and just keep stitching around and around. This is one I did off camera with the same design, the tone-on-tone effect, so you can see the various widths of the zigzag. On the wrong side, I've trimmed away as much as possible of the stabilizer. And now to get rid of the rest of it, we're going to do a little pressing. Set your iron on a temperature that's compatible to your fabric. And work from the wrong side of the fabric. Now this is going to be maybe a little surprise to you. It was the first time I did this. And press a couple of seconds. And this is correct. You want it to look this way. It melts away the stabilizer. It's very delicate to the fabric because you don't have to tear at it, you don't have to wet it, and possibly use a brush if you had a clean toothbrush that you use it for crafting or sewing. Let me give it one more little press, but it just disintegrates the fabric. It's kind of miraculous. I really enjoy it, and it really has not changed at all the texture of the fabric The only little disadvantages, maybe it's slightly messy at first, but you can see what a great stabilizer it is and what a nice thread-only applique you have when you're finished. What little girl wouldn't be happy wearing sunbonnet suit? And Molly is showing off our great applique design, a kind of a contemporary sunbonnet suit made with a blind hem stitch and clear monofilament thread. I'll also be giving you a no-sew variation to this sunbonnet suit design. My objective in this series is to just give you some creative ideas, some possibilities of ways of putting on embellishments or appliques. You may choose one or a couple of them to use, and this one, I hope you'll give a look at it. We're not going to be working with a paper-backed fusible web, but rather with interfacing, fusible interfacing, something lightweight. This happens to be a knit fusible. It has like a tricot with the fusible sprayed on the back. Any really type of lightweight interfacing will do. As I mentioned, we're working with sunbonnet suit, quite a quaint design that's been around for a while for quilters and sewers alike. And on the interfacing, trace the shape of the design, just the way we worked with the other paperback fusible webs of tracing the shape right onto the paper side. Here we're tracing it onto the fabric side, not the fusible side. Trace each element of the design. And now I'll trace this arm section. You trace the dress as well as the little foot or slipper. And it's right on the interfacing. Now roughly cut this out and meet right sides together. The right side of the fabric to the right side of the interfacing. You're going to be sewing from the interfacing side using a short stitch length, sew all the way around, in this instance, her little hat or bonnet. I use a short stitch length. It's easier to maneuver corners and curves if you have a shorter stitch length, kind of like driving the mountains. You don't like to go fast, or you shouldn't go fast, and this is kind of the same principle, just a little bit faster and easier to sew. Now if you're wondering how are we going to get inside this applique, well, after trimming around the edges, and make the seam allowance quite narrow, maybe only about 1/8 of an inch. You don't have to measure, just a narrow little 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeter width seam allowance. Then separate the fabrics and make a slit in the interfacing and turn this right side out. This is why you want to have narrow seam allowances. Now this interfacing section is not going to show. It's a stabilizer, but it also clean finishes the edges. Isn't that kind of fun? Now I work a little bit to get this turned right side out. As you can see, I'll take a little time, and I'm going to go through the opening to bring out the points. And now the next step is to go to the ironing board and press around the edges. Now the interfacing, the fusible, is on the inside, and here we have the knit shaping on the outside. And as I press this, I'm going to kind of just use the tip of my iron and fuse the layers together, kind of rolling it with my finger. And this will nicely shape this area and get this all nicely pressed and roll it, you know, just kind of curve that edge, and you'll have a nice flat applique. This is what you'll be doing to all the pieces. Now the advantage of working with this is now it can become, if you'd like, possibly a no-sew applique. Now again, I don't always no-sew by any means, but perhaps a beginner, or if you're using a craft project or a home deck project, this might be a nice element. And that is to use a liquid fusible that comes in a bottle rather than by the yard on a web. And simply apply the glue. It's a glue-like process around the edges. And advance the heat or advance the drying by using your hair dryer, and let it air dry, however you'd like to work with it. And on this instance, I've already air dried the little foot section. So I'd place it on my fabric. Notice this top area that's going to have an overlap. I didn't even bother seaming. And here we have the skirt area. And now cover with a press cloth. I don't have all the elements finished yet for this applique, but you'll soon see that following the manufacturer's instructions, by pressing, it becomes very permanent. It'll take a little time to press around the edges, but we have kind of tested other types of appliques or embellishments by using this as a permanent bonding, and it works well. And that stays on, and if it ever needs to have a little bit more fusing, just press it with an iron. we would continue to build this, and that way we'd have a kind of no-sew sunbonnet Sue. The other option that I'd like to show you now is how to blind stitch around the edge with monofilament thread to make it a sewing and a stabilized applique. To stitch around this applique using invisible stitch is kind of fun. You don't have to be really accurate because you're using almost invisible thread. Let's take a closer look at our contemporary sunbonnet Sue. It's a much smaller design than the design I showed you earlier, but I'd like to point out that when stitching around the edges, first I worked with the background pieces like the little feet, then the dress would go on, the arm, and then finally the bonnet at the top. So kind of working from the background to the foreground for stitching purposes as well as placing the appliques on the design. Now we've used monofilament thread. You may call it many different names, nylon thread, clear thread, and it's very clear. This is obviously the clear version. It also comes in smoke for darker fabrics. It's like very, very fine fishing line and easy to work with, almost invisible to see. On your bobbin thread for this type of work, you simply need to use thread that matches your base fabric. You don't have to work with this in both top and bottom. Then you can hardly see where your thread is if you do that. Now, such a machine for a blind hem stitch, a very common stitch on almost all machines. It has about 3 or 4 straight stitches followed by zigzag. Straight stitches and then a zigzag. You can see that stitch on the top. I've changed the stitch width to be very narrow, about as narrow as possible. Number 1, can you see how it just has that little bite as it goes across? We're using a short stitch length, easier to turn corners, but and a little bite which will catch the edge of the applique, making it look like you put it on by hand instead it was put on by machine. Now the sample that I'm working with is the same sample that I used to fuse on some of the pieces. Obviously you wouldn't combine these two techniques, but for demonstration purposes I'm going to do that. The straight stitch goes on the very edge of the fabric, not in the red, but on the very edge of the blue. And I'm stitching to have the zig go in the fabric to give that little hand-picked look. As I mentioned, you don't have to sew just exactly on the very edge because the monofilament thread will kind of hide your stitching. But yet the little zig will look like it's been hand-picked, put on by hand, and it's just kind of nice. I really kind of think this is a great technique. For those of you who are quilters and maybe you've quilted some areas and sewn this on by hand, let me just raise this and put that under the foot, you'll find that this is a great quilting technique as well as a sewing technique. So sew on the very edges, and I'll show you that you really can't see this stitch at all. Pull this out and cut my threads, and when you look at it, it's invisible to the eye, but yet is put on very securely and looks very neat. Now, just as a quick recap, to make this great invisible-looking applique, you trace all the elements of the design on fusible interfacing on the fabric side of the fusible interfacing, and I just have the hat and part of the arm traced on this fusible. Then meet the pieces to the right side of fabric, roughly cutting around the edges, leaving a 1/4 of an inch or so of seam allowances. And stitch the two together, right sides together, the fabric side of the interfacing to the right side of the fabric, using a short stitch length. And notice that the seams have now been trimmed very close to the stitching. Put a slit in the fabric, turn right side out, and press around the edges to get this clean finished edge. And now top stitch in place with a blind hem stitch. It's a great contemporary sunbonnet Sue. In the second program of my series on applique, Endless Possibilities, I detailed a lot of creative ways of using appliques, the different types of stitches, of blending and varying the stitch width, as well as doing a thread-only applique, and then that invisible stitching as I did on that cute sunbonnet Sue idea. There's one other idea I'd like to point out, and that is sometimes appliques have various details or inner markings that are important to get to the applique, and you can transfer those lines, as in the veins of this leaf, right onto the paper side of the web. The web usually has that paper backing, and mark the lines. Position it on top of the applique after you've done the stitching around the edges with tape, as you can see here, and then stitch. And we just use that straight seed stitch along these lines, and then the stitching perforates the paper, and when you tear it away, you can see that the lines are there. It gets the lines in the right spot. You get great dimension. It's a way to create that applique and make it look so professional. When I come back, we'll do our third program of this 3-part series. Let me tell you about Nancy's Notions, a Sewing with Nancy sponsor. All the notions I use on my program can be found in my current Nancy's Notions catalog. The 176-page full-color catalog contains over 3,000 items. You can save up to 20% on every order. You can order from the convenience of your own home with our toll-free order line. You'll receive your order fast. Orders are shipped within 2 working days, and we guarantee all our products. Shop Nancy's Notions. We understand sewing, quilting, and serging. It's time for Sewing with Nancy. I'm Nancy Zeman. Today I have my third program of my series entitled Applique Endless Possibilities. We're doing a fun project first of all, starting off with garden flags. We have 6 variations of these fun flags. The techniques to sew it are different than we've had in previous programs. We're using flag fabric. The appliques are reversible, great for outside use, to give as gifts, to use in your garden, however you please. And that's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy. We've had a lot of fun with these garden flag ideas in our sewing room. We have 6 for you to choose from. The designs for the appliques are included in today's booklet that accompanies the program. We're going to work with the beat, first of all. I'll be tracing on flag fabric. You can find that at your favorite fabric store or through your favorite mail order catalog. And very little of the flag fabric is needed. The outward flag size is 7 by 9. That's the size I started with. And you can see the small little sections you need of the various colors. With working with really dark, intense fabrics, it may be difficult to trace. And we have to trace this time. We're not working with a fusible web because the applique is reversible. We have to trace the design on the fabric. I'm working on a light table. I just turned the light on, or you could place the design and fabric on a window and outline the shape on the fabric. Just simply make the outline. And I'm not cutting 2 separate pieces for each beat, but rather making it all on one section. Simple step. Perhaps you can see the outline just a little bit better. I've placed another sample in some dark fabric over here, and then simply cut out the design following the edges that you've traced, leaving the inner markings. Later on I'll do some stitching on there. Now there are 2 ways that you can position this on your fabric. You can either straight stitch around the edges, or you can fuse it on using a liquid glue. I'm going to show you both ways. First of all, the fastest way. This is a liquid glue. We've used this on Sewing with Nancy before, and on the wrong side, simply add a fine bead along the edges. And then you have to let this dry. Go around all the edges, and I'm working on some paper so that I can get it close to the edge. If you use your hair dryer, it will help speed it along a little bit and go around all the various pieces. I have 2 that have been drying, and you can see that it gets kind of, you can touch it, it doesn't come off. And now we'll simply place this on the 7 by 9 square fabric. I have both the beat and the green top ready to go into place. I'm going to place it on the beat, on the flag, all the beat sections on the flag, just the way you'd like them. Cover with a press cloth and fuse. Follow the directions on the label as far as how long to do the pressing. I always like to use a press cloth in case any of the extra little fusing agents would perhaps get on the bottom of the iron, and this makes it a little bit safer. Let this dry so it's room temperature before you do any cutting. Or if you'd like, rather than fusing it down, just straight stitch with a short stitch length all the way around the edges. Now to make it reversible, you have to do some cutting. And on this sample, which has been dry, it's cool to the touch, I can simply separate the fabrics, kind of pull them apart as you can see, and then place a clip in the backing fabric, not to cut the purple section, and trim away. Make the clip a little bit bigger, there we go, and trim away, trimming to the stitching line or to the glue line, as in this case, going all the way around. You can take your time doing this, and that's what makes it reversible. Off camera, I've trimmed this section, and this is a little neater, and you can see the reversibility, and now it's time to do the stitching. The sewing of these flag fabrics for the applique is very simple. We're going to do a few little changes at the sewing machine. First of all, the tension. On traditional satin stitching around an applique, I loosen the tension by 2 notches. I've gone from a 5 to a 3. But on the flag fabric, since the stitch is visible from both sides of this reversible flag, we need the tension set at the normal setting. For the thread, as you can see, we have purple thread in this applique on both front and back, so on both bobbin and top thread, use the same color thread. Now, if we're doing the stitching, the satin stitching around the edges, we need a stabilizer. And let me show you the two options that we have. Either the fuse section, or in this instance, when I edge stitched around the appliques to position them, again, it's been trimmed from the underside, and now we can satin stitch, or just the fused section, and again we have a stabilizer. I'm using the water-soluble stabilizer so that I'm not going to have any whiskers left from a white kind of non-woven stabilizer. Satin stitch around the edges using, and I'm going to stitch the background piece first. Notice that the leaf section, the green section, comes on top of the beads, so we'll do the back section first, or the underneath section. I'm using a slightly wider satin stitch than what I recommended for other projects. It needs to be maybe just a little bit more durable, so I have it set at about a 4 width, and you could do it, of course, according to whatever you'd like. You may want to also try to taper the stitches as we discussed earlier in this series, and if possible, stop with the needle in the down position. Makes it easier to turn the corners. I did some tapering of that stitch, and now as I start sewing the other direction, I'll just bump that stitch up again, keep pushing those buttons until I get the widest width that I'd like, and keep sewing. And it's just basic satin stitching techniques, all the techniques that we went through earlier in this program. And I'll, again, just sew a portion of this for you today. It doesn't take a lot of time, as you can see. Now, after I bring this up, to remove the excess backing, you simply tear away the stabilizer, and if you'd like to spritz it with water to get rid of some of the excess, you can do that. Save the stabilizer for another project. Then to finish the design, stitch around your white lines wherever you have any inner detail. Of course, you do that before removing the stabilizer, and then serge or satin stitch or clean finish the edges along the sides and the lower edge, and turn under about a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and edge stitch so it's nice and clean. Then on this flag sample, to get the casing for the wire, turn under about 5/8 of an inch and edge stitch a 1/2 inch from the fold. We just used some construction wire, used the help of an extra hand to bend the wire, and now we have flags that can simply be put in an arrangement in your garden, wherever you'd like. It's fun to make and fun to sew. Here's the next applique possibility. We have dimension, texture combined with the applique. This great nautical scene appliqued onto a shirt can be easily accomplished by first tucking the fabric and then using the traditional applique techniques. You can use this on knit fabrics or woven fabrics, and I'm going to show you 3 different ways to tuck fabric. You may already know a couple of them, but here they are in sequence. First of all, a very traditional way of creating tucks or marking the fabric for tucks. I'm working with some variegated or gradated fabric that kind of goes from one color to the next. It's kind of nice for this nautical look. And I'm going to meet the cross or lengthwise edges together, and then place a ruler or measuring tool along one of the lengthwise edges, the raw edges, and nip or clip every 1/2 inch or every inch, depending upon how deep you'd like the tucks to be. Just make these little 1/4 of an inch clips. That way you'll have markings or guidelines for quick access when making the tucks. So I've clipped the edge, and now do some pressing. I wouldn't create a lot of tucks in this manner, but for an applique, this certainly works out well. I'm going to find the 2 mates, the tucks that meet, and meet it to one of the other tucks. Cross. Let me get this first one straight. That's always important to kind of get the first one on line. Then it's easier to get all subsequent tucks in place and press. Find the next set of tucks that you'd like to work with and fold and press. As you'll see later when I show you a close-up of the top again, we use different widths of tucked fabric, so you don't have to make these tucks all the same size. And just keep on folding and tucking, and by using this method, it's very simple to tuck a small section of fabric. I get sent a lot of samples to try out, and one of them that recently came across my desk was a tape that could withstand the heat of the iron, and it has various markings on it, perfect for working with tucking, obviously. And you place a tape along each side of the fabric, making certain that at the very top of the fabric you have the same markings, so that the markings were aligned, and then instead of using the nip method, we'll simply just match the lines, fold to a line on the side of the tape, and again press. Make sure I'm lining this up correctly, and press. And you can press right over that tape, whereas most sewing tapes you couldn't do that. And then find your next tuck wherever you'd like it. I'll make these quite narrow, and tuck. As I say, many of you may have used some of these before, but it's always nice to have a quick review. And hold the fabric taut with each fold, and you'll have easy tucks. Now you may want to pin the sides a little bit after you've done the pressing, because I'll have a hint for you later to keep them in shape so that the tucks don't move out of shape. The last way I'd like to show you for working with tucks is with a pleater. And perhaps you may have one of these louvered sections at home, a small little section to work with louvers. And again, I'm going to be using the fabric, but this time I have the wrong side of the fabric up, not the right side. And really you could press either way, it doesn't matter. The tucks are reversible. But in this instance, I like the wrong side up. And I'd find my first louver that I'd like to place a tuck, use the fingernails, credit card, we've even used metal bars. Create the first tuck, give a quick press to set that tuck or pleat, and you can use each louver, or I'm going to skip every other one. Again, you could keep everything, make sure everything's tucked into place. I'm going to tuck another one. You may want to take a little bit more time than I'm managing, but you can see how nicely that gets, and you can easily work with it without having the tucks come out of place. Then after you've tucked the section that you'd like, let's say you'd maybe like a 6-inch section tucked, then cut a piece of fusible interfacing. And you can do this for all of the tuck ideas that you can make, and press the interfacing on the wrong side. And on this sample, I would suggest to put the interfacing and fuse it in place before taking it out of the louvers. That way you don't have to worry about repositioning the tucks before permanently keeping those tucks in place. And that way we can work with this and we don't have to worry about one tuck coming out. It's kind of a nice thought. Then we'll use traditional applique ideas. We have a sailboat design, and you'll get that design in the booklet. And we have placed the direction of the tucks in various areas. Simply, of course, on the paperback fusible web, trace each section of your applique, leaving a little space around each section so that you can have room to cut. Roughly cut it out. Remember, this has the fusible web applied to the other side. It's kind of shiny, you can see that web. And then position, however you'd like the, let's position it this way, but of course, on the flip side, position this into place, press it on, and then you'd cut out your section of this sailboat following the black line. And here we have the various elements for this design, or a few of them. We're going to use traditional applique ideas by simply, on the wrong side, this paperback fusible web happened to be gridded. You'd simply peel off the gridded. The fabric doesn't come unpleated, it stays nicely pleated, and etc. And position it wherever you'd like. Fuse, and then do zigzagging around the edges. Let me show you again a close-up of our finished shirt. We used a knit fabric on this one, so knits or wovens work extremely well. The large circle in the background had large tucks, and the sails, narrower ones, and the base about medium width. You're the judge. There's no right or wrong here, so you can make it however you'd like. I just think it's fun to combine techniques. This time we have combined texture and applique. It's one of the options that you can use in applique sewing. Next, an applique possibility that allows the fabric to ravel, to fringe. I call it a fringe applique. I think you'll appreciate the inspiration, and maybe try something like this on your next applique project. As I mentioned, this is more of an inspiration idea than a definite step-by-step. I had this fabric in my sewing stash for a long time and tried to find something to work with it. And since it raveled just almost invariably, almost too much, I thought, well, let's take advantage of the ravels rather than use it as a detriment. Cut a square, rectangle, or triangle, best with geometric shapes, slightly smaller than the fashion square, and fuse it onto the fabric, onto its wrong side, and then remove the paper backing. Well, the nice part about it is that the fusing will stop the fabric from raveling, so we can ravel it until the fuse section. and then the rest the fabric will not come off. Then do this around all 4 sides or 3 sides, whatever you'd like for the raveled section. And on the actual garment, I'll show you how I have it placed. I didn't have a lot of fabric, I have to admit that. So I had to use 2 different combinations, kind of the textured stripe and then a solid to go along with it, and fuse the sections to the fabric and stitch just with a straight stitch. This is not difficult stitching. Straight stitch along the fringe section. And I saved some of those fringe sections and stitched it or placed it on the fabric. I highlighted it with a little piping, which I think gives it some nice detail. In addition to using just plain appliques, you could also have appliques that are not permanently put down all the way around the edges. More of a dimensional look. The pseudo pin that I have placed in one of the upper sections of the vest, again, takes this geometric look. Now, you don't have to make something just like this, but just to show you that there are a lot of possibilities of applying fabric to fabric. Whether it's fringe, stitched on, however you'd like to handle it, it gives a nice effect. Pen stitch applique is our next possibility, and around this placemat I have pen stitched using a pen rather than machine stitching, as well as doing the same type of unique stitching around the watermelon applique. This is totally a no-sew project. It is fused together, all the fabric layers are fused, and the stitching, of course, is done by hand with a pen. I truly love to sew, but there are times when maybe you'd like to create something with children or friends that requires not using a sewing machine, but yet getting the applique idea, and this is one to work with it, with a no-sew applique and the pen stitching. Early in this program or series, I showed you some other no-sew projects using a fusible web, a paper-backed web that had a much thicker webbing. I've peeled away portions of this web so that you can see the denseness of the webbing. Only use this for no-sew projects, as your machine needle may become gummed if sewing through this webbing. Choose your favorite placemat or table runner size. Fuse 2 layers of fabric, wrong sides together, this base same on both sides, and then fuse the webbing, the paper-backed web, to all the elements, the design features. In this instance, we have some border pieces as well as watermelon slices. On the wrong side of this strip, you can see the thickness that shines a little bit, so you can see how dense this really is and how well it will stay fused. One additional hint for the binding of this placemat: rather than having raw edges meeting along the edge of the placemat, we cut the binding double and mitered the corner just by cutting. Can't get much simpler than that. And sandwich the placemat between the webbing, or between the binding I should say, and fuse. And this way, when you're finished, this raw edge will be a fabric fold as opposed to fabric raw edges. When working with the stitching idea, you're going to be using the pen, and as I mentioned, it's a pigment pen. You'll find these in craft stores and catalogs, and stitching around the edges by making marks as opposed to using a machine stitching. You can stitch, pen stitch that is, by after you fused it into place, before, it doesn't matter at all, and I'm just kind of using a running stitch as I'm going around this area. Now, there are other elements to this applique, the watermelon seeds, small little details, and instead of sewing these small pieces on, we'll just fill in the blanks. It's coloring. That's why I mentioned this is a good craft project for children. They may want to help you do this. So if you're looking for a fast way of appliquing, do the pen stitch around the edges to create a great detail. It's time to wrap up this series on appliques, but before I do, a quick review of making the garden flags with the reversible appliques. Remember, I positioned the appliques to the back fabric by either fusing it on with a liquifuse or straight stitching, then doing the satin stitching. Make certain that you put a stabilizer, a washable stabilizer like Wash-Away works great. But keep in mind when satin stitching to do the background first, like this section of the bead, then the stitching is covered by the foreground stitching so that it is layered and rather sequenced. On the flip side, when you remove the stabilizer, the applique becomes reversible. We still have to remove it from the inner section. The little whiskers will simply disappear if you squirt this with water, immerse the nylon fabric into water, and you have a great reversible applique. These are fun. We've done the vegetables. You can make flowers, herbs. Get a wire cutter or pliers and some wire from your hardware store to make the holders, either like a croquet ring or just a single flagpole, and there you have a great idea. I hope you enjoyed this series on applique. Bye for now.
This Sewing with Nancy video has been brought to you in part by FOF. You'll do your best sewing on a FOF. By Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears. And by Nancy's Notion Sewing Catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and notions.